Hi, today we'll connect tRPC to the front end. So here's the tRPC site. It's important to note that tRPC doesn't rely on React. It just synchronizes types. But it also has a special module to connect it to React, which acts as a wrapper around both tRPC and React Query. What does React Query offer us? It allows easy server requests on their own, stores state information regarding responses, refreshes these queries, and so on. During the process, it will become clear why it's easier to show than to explain. So, let's slowly start connecting. I'll immediately warn you this lesson is essentially one of the most challenging and complex because it will cover practically everything. In this process, we'll even have to transform our project into a real monorepo, where we'll take some dependencies from the backend to the front end. All right, let's get started. We'll slowly figure everything out. Okay, we need to go into the backend folder, go into the frontend folder, meaning into the babab. Now let's install the necessary dependencies for our frontend. The necessary dependencies are the following. It's the tRPC client, its adapter for React, and the React query itself. Let's install them. All right. Now let's create a tRPC file in the frontend. I suggest keeping everything that isn't a component, but some kind of auxiliary stuff in the lib folder. How to name the file and how to organize the folders is in principle up to everyone to decide. And as the project evolves, yes, we can rearrange these folders and sort the files. We'll get to that, but for now, let's leave it as is. All right, let's create a file named trp.tsx. Why tsx? Because it will contain a React component. And when there's a React component, you need to name the file tsx so JSX works, as we discussed. It's the structure that somewhat resembles HTML. All right, now let's start connecting things. How to connect? Well, first, you need to import from the adapter for React, create tPC React. And then you need to create a variable tRPC, which is called like this. After this, the client-side tRPC will be available on the front end, which will be aware of all backend types. To make it aware of all backend types, we need to inform it about these types. This construct is passing the type into this situation. We'll talk more about TypeScript constructs later when we write them ourselves. For now, just get used to using them and gain some exposure. And this is how we pass types. Here, where do we have the tRPC router type? The tRPC router type is in the backend, but it needs to be on the front end. And ultimately, we get it like this, with a regular import, tRPC router from the backend. But our project isn't ready for this yet, and we will teach it now. It doesn't understand what this module from the backend is and where to get it, which makes sense. Let's make it possible to import something from the backend to the front end. We turn all this into a monorepo using pnpm. What do we need to do? First, we need to create a file pnpm workspaces.yaml and describe here which packages we have. We have a backend package and a web app package. Moreover, we describe here not their package JSON names, but the folder names. Okay, that's done. Next, we need to add the backend to the front-end dependencies. For this, we go to the JSON package of the web app and add the backend to our dependencies. Such a structure in workspaces.yaml will indicate that the package needs to be located somewhere in the installed modules, namely where we have specified the workspace, and that it can be absolutely any version. The name must be specified as it is in the JSON package of our backend. Currently, it's simply called backend, but we need to rename it to this structure, as it is also an accepted standard. We'll name it Idionic BK. Similarly, let's rename the web app using the same principle. Then, since we have a monorepo, we should also have a package.json at the top level. So, package.json, all right, but at this stage, it will be primitive, though later we will certainly make it a bit more complex. So, here's such an idiom. After completing all these procedures, let's briefly revisit the pattern. There's a package.json at the root. There's information on what packages we have, and we've added the backend to dependencies in the web app. Now let's check if we've done everything well, and for this, we'll call pnpm install. By calling pnpm install, it should do everything necessary under the hood to actually include the backend in dependencies. So, package limit descent in workspace. Well, in social, it didn't work out. So, there's really Idionic. The backend is there. Let's exit at the top level. Okay, so what if the web API works now? No. So perhaps there is some typo here. Let's see how to do it right. Workspace. Here's a mistake. Not S, but E. Let's try again. Actually, now that there's no typo, we won't need to call web app anymore. That is, it's enough to just call it at the root, and it will automatically install all packages in both the web app, backend, and root package JSON. Of course, throughout the course, we'd like everything to go smoothly, but in reality, it doesn't happen. Something will always be broken. You'll spend half your time on Google and Stack Overflow, and that's normal. Mistakes and errors will always be there, and you need to remain calm about them. Even when writing lessons for a textbook, they will adhere to this policy, okay? We've set everything up. Now let's go and see if we manage to import the type from the backend to the frontend. Yes, great. If you hold Command and click, you can always navigate to where it was imported from. Great. We now have tRPC. Let's continue with the integration. Now we need to create two clients. tRPC client and React query client. Create a query client. You create it with this command. The query client is generated with the query client. So this is the query client. The query client comes from React Query. All right, they took it from there. And we also need the tRPC client. Now I'm going to write the code first, then explain it a little bit. tRPC client. tRPC client. This batch link is taken from the standard tRPC client. I didn't come up with all this code myself. I just took it from the documentation. And then we'll need a component that will run our application. Into our React query. Good. And here is such a construction. So you see, everything will be functional. Let's figure it out. In general, the query client is a React query client whose documentation is written on this site. This thing specifically manages the request logic, not types, and it has some settings. I will immediately set that there should be no attempt to refetch the request if an error occurs. That way, it will be easier to develop and clearer what's happening. Also, by default, it acts so that if your cursor goes out of the window and it becomes, in general, you leave the window and then return, it can refetch the data, assuming they are outdated. So it's really a smart thing that does useful things under the hood. But during development, it's inconvenient because requests will happen for unclear reasons and timings, and we don't need that. That's it. We've set it up, and it will be comfortable to work with. Next, we need the tRPC client itself. The tRPC client needs to know where our endpoint is for all the tRPC routes. We defined it in the last lesson on the backend. Here it is. Yes, expressapp.use, tRPC. And then, look, we need to provide all this. So let me write down where this will be used to clarify why it's indicated here this way. In our app.tsx. All right, let me comment this out for now. Our app.tsx will be completely different now. Let's call this OIDS page for now, and the app itself will be like this. And the app itself will look like this. Basically, we'll pass all our pages inside the tRPC provider. And thanks to this, tRPC functions will be available within these pages. Let's get back to the tRPC provider. So, tRPC has its own provider, and it needs to know both about the tRPC client and the query client. Also, for React Query to work, we need to pass the React Query client into the query client provider, which comes from here. It looks complicated, but in practice, it will be easy to use. And I repeat, you only set this up at the beginning of the project. If you dig into the documentation and work with it for a while, it will eventually make sense. All right, we've passed all of this over here. Now let's use this. So far, this is just the setup. Let's just make sure that nothing is broken. We need to start the backend. And start the front end. Okay, let's check the browser to see if our code is working now. Okay, so far, no errors have appeared. That's good. Great. Let's move this All Ideas page to a separate component. I suggest storing all pages in a folder. Pages and name each page in a separate folder. All Ideas page. And at the end of each page component, add page. And here's the file index.tsx. Good. Insert it here. And closed everything on the right. Writing. Auto import is suggested. Good. Let's check if we broke it now. It works. Phew. Now let's request data from the backend. We don't need ideas here anymore. We're going to get them from the backend. How do we do this? Let's import our tRPC. Import tRPC from elib tRPC. Great. Now let's request the query itself. The query hasn't appeared yet. tRPC. Why didn't it import for us? Because it doesn't have tRPC. And look, it offers us autocomplete. There are some auxiliary things here, and here's our function from the backend. We can select it. We select it. Since this is a query, we use the hook. Use query. We'll talk more about React hooks later. The idea is that as this query runs, the data in the result variable changes. I suggest we request them now. For now, we'll do a return here. We'll comment it out. Now we will just return nothing. And here we call console.log result. And let's see what's stored in this result. Okay, everything is fine. We have a lot stored in result. But that's not the point right now. An error occurred trying to make a request to the backend. Our backend is on one address, frontend on another, and we have a keyRS policy error. We need to sort that out too. For this, we need to install something on the backend. This policy simply protects our frontend from requests to other servers. We need to deal with this. Let's sort it out. Okay, let's go to the backend and install the course plugin. So, cd backend and the course itself. And we also need the types for this course, cd back type course. Actually, it's better not to install the types prematurely, because at any moment they might start coming with the package, and then it will just be extra information for our package JSON. Let's just connect it for now. How is it done? Import the course and apply it to Express. It has various settings and more, but you can check that in the documentation. The simplest way to use it is like this. However, it does complain about types, so let's install them. All right, installed. And now there is no error. We still receive a very large object here, which allows us to know everything about our request. On the surface, the most popular thing is what? It's the date. This is where the data coming from our server will be stored. And here it's really the same object that we return from the backend, which is very convenient. So, we understand that if we return an object with the key IDS from the backend, which should contain an array, then in data, there will be an object with IDS containing this array. Great, great. If there's an error, it will be in error. You can also check it via the Boolean flag from error. If something is loading, then loading will be true. We also have functions here that we can call, for example, to reload this endpoint, and also some other states, and we will work with many of them in this tutorial. In fact, with all of them necessary. All right, let's now create our page using backend data. So, where is our page? Here is our page. Let's do it this way now. This is all we need here. Let's display a loading message if it's loading. Wadin said no, just text. Later, it will look much nicer with real spinners and so on. But we'll do it primitively, just to figure all this out. If we suddenly get an error, we'll display it too. Well, just a simple text. Error message. Okay, and if there's no error, then let's display all ideas. And the IDs now reside inside the data variable. Data IDs. As you see, we got this from the backend, but we know all about types. So if we were to rewrite it here, we would write ID, put a dot, and it would suggest what data we can get from there. Without tRPC and some backend front-end merging, this wouldn't happen. So all incoming data would just be some random JSON for us. So this is all thanks to tRPC. We know types thanks to tRPC, and things like isLoading, isError, etc. thanks to React Query. All right? And in tRPC, there's this thing where loading actually exists in two states, isLoading and isFetching. IsLoading is when the loading occurs for the first time. IsFetching is called whenever any loading happens again. We'll look into this in more detail later when we write various subsequent queries. For now, let's just say that for any type of loading, we will call loading. All right? Let it be so. Now let's take a look at the application. Okay, everything is displayed. Let's slow down the internet speed to slow 3G and check the loading state. I refresh the page and it loads slowly because I throttled it. All right, let's wait a little. Oh, it's loading. So it's really loading. And here we got back our data. What else I would like to say about loading? So we see that there was a request in the network. I'll remove this. There was a request in the network, and it passed some patch here in the get parameter. Why did this happen? We specified in our tRPC client settings that we want to use batching. Why is this needed? So that if we, for example, call 3 queries simultaneously on the front end, it will combine them into one, send it to the backend, and on the backend, they will all be distributed to the necessary functions, all return a response, and then the front end will receive them with a single request. So it's actually just some optimization, but we don't have to worry. tRPC and React Query do it all under the hood for us. Let's now take a look at how errors pop up from the backend. Let's add an error to our endpoint. Let's enter like this. They will just throw it themselves, right? I'll compare. Test error, test error. Okay, let's see. Test error. Great, great, just as we expected. Let's look at the request itself. In the response, since it was a batch request, we got an array, and in the first query, just an error. Now the PC has formed it itself. We'll work with errors too, and write some improvements for errors. But for now, we can just see that we can handle errors. So we've handled the errors. Let's remove this. Good. What is it complaining about? That's ESLint. We'll talk about ESLint later. We'll actually cover ESLint probably in the upcoming lessons. All right, let me check if we haven't forgotten anything, since a lot was done. Okay, we've added everything on the back end, added tRPC to the front end, created a monorepo, made the page, removed the error, and the page works. So that's all. From here on, things will keep getting better than they were in this lesson, and it will be much easier and more interesting. Nevertheless, congratulations to everyone for finally connecting our tRPC to both backend and front end. Thank you. Wonderful.